Fort Belvedere, Surrey, 10 December 1936. The house sits on Shrubs Hill in Windsor Great Park, a Gothic Revival folly of stone-washed brick built as a toy in 1750 and expanded into a home, its crenellated walls overlooking Virginia water on 59 acres of Crown Estate land. The triangular turreted structure had been, in its time, a summer folly for a Duke of Cumberland, a tea-house for Queen Victoria, a place for firing salutes. Edward had renovated it obsessively after his father gave it to him in 1929. Swimming pool, steam room, tennis court, modern bathrooms adjacent to nearly every room, central heating throughout when most English houses still managed on coal fires. He had planted roses and irises along the battlement walls. He had mowed hay in the summer months and built a rock garden with water pumped from Virginia water below. He wrote that he created a home at the fort, just as my father and grandfather had created one at Sandringham. Here I spent some of the happiest days of my life. This morning, it's very quiet. 4 men are in a room. The December light comes in at an angle. 3 of the men are princes of the blood: Prince Albert, Duke of York; Prince Henry, Duke of Gloucester; Prince George, Duke of Kent. The 4th is their eldest brother, and he is signing his name 4 times on the instrument of abdication. Once for himself, once for each of the witnessing brothers. The papers are formal, official, produced through Parliament, and they will travel from this house in the Surrey countryside to Westminster, where they will be given legal force the following day. The man currently signing will cease to be King of the United Kingdom and the British dominions beyond the seas, Emperor of India. His reign lasted 327 days. He was never crowned. He would later write that when he stepped outside afterward, he felt like a swimmer surfacing from a great depth. He described inhaling the fresh morning air. He retained the fort's visitors' book, the record of every weekend gathering, every informal dinner, every private hour, and would carry it with him to every subsequent home he shared with the woman he had abdicated for. Britain received all of this as the punctuation of a love story, the most romantic abdication in history, complete. A king who had surrendered everything, a woman who had asked for nothing and received the blame anyway. Wallis Simpson, the Yankee harlot, as newspapers outside Britain had already named her. The schemer who toppled a crown. That version is half right and entirely wrong about what mattered. The man who stepped out of Fort Belvedere into the Surrey morning air wasn't only a lovesick king. He was a man whose documented political sympathies, his circle of contacts, his conduct during the opening years of the Second World War, and the assessment of his own government made him a direct liability to the country he had just stopped governing, at the exact moment that country needed its head of state to be something other than what he was. The abdication the country mourned was, by every piece of evidence that has since emerged, the exit the country required. The woman at the center of it didn't plan any of this. She was trying, by her own account, to get out. That is precisely the point. This is a persuasive case, not a settled historical verdict. The evidence is real. The argument is defensible. Whether it adds up to rescue is a judgment you can make for yourself by the end. She was born on 19th June 1896 at Square Cottage in Blue Ridge Summit, Pennsylvania, a summer resort town on the Pennsylvania-Maryland border where Baltimore families retreated from the seasonal heat. The cottage sat across from the Monterey Country Club. The town's largest establishment, the Monterey Inn, occupied a central building with individual wooden cottages scattered around it. Her name was Bessie Wallis Warfield. Her father, Teakle Wallis Warfield, died of tuberculosis in November 1896. She wasn't yet 5 months old when she became a dependent. The Warfield name carried social weight in Baltimore. Her grandfather, Henry MacDear Warfield, had been described as one of the best known and personally one of the most popular citizens of Baltimore, and had run for mayor in 1875. Her uncle, Solomon Davies Warfield, served as postmaster of Baltimore. and later president of the Continental Trust Company and the Seaboard Airline Railway. He was the kind of man who had opinions about which families belonged to Baltimore society and the standing to make those opinions matter. He funded Wallis's education at Oldfield School, the most expensive girls' school in Maryland, around 1910. He helped arrange her entry into the Baltimore debutante circuit, presenting her to the world in 1914 at the season's events in a gown that, 22 years later, newspapers would try to reconstruct from memory when they were piecing together her childhood. He built the social architecture of her life. He didn't leave her money. The distinction matters. She was raised with the habits and expectations of wealth without the thing itself. The difference between those two conditions, knowing how a room of rich people worked while not being rich, is an education with no equivalent. It sharpens you in a particular direction. You learn to read status the way a surveyor reads land, quickly, accurately, with an eye for what the surface is concealing. Her mother, Alice Montague, described by biographer Anne Seba as spirited if flighty, eventually ran a boarding house on Woodley Road in Washington, taking in lodgers to sustain herself. That was the family's economic floor, an old name in a modest house. Wallis grew up watching the gap between her family's social position and their financial reality with the sharpness that comes from navigating it daily. A fellow pupil at Oldfields recalled, "She was bright, brighter than all of us. She made up her mind to go to the head of the class, and she did." She was, all her adult life, impeccably presented, always precisely dressed, always composed. The precision was itself a declaration. Whatever else was uncertain, appearance was controlled. From this world she built the discipline that would define her for 6 decades. She learned to assess a room before she entered it. She learned to listen with complete attention, which is rarer than it sounds and more valuable in social currency than most people understand. The trick of focused listening, making whoever is speaking feel as though they are the most interesting person present, is extraordinarily effective and very difficult to fake over time. She didn't fake it. She was genuinely watchful, genuinely curious about the people she was with, and she deployed that curiosity as a tool. She learned to produce a sharp remark at exactly the right moment, cutting enough to register, precise enough to land as wit rather than aggression, never so pointed that it drew visible blood. A dry observation delivered at the right pitch, with no apparent effort. This was craftsmanship. It required an accurate read of the room, a sense of timing, and the restraint to save the best remarks for moments when they would land. Her first marriage demonstrated what happened when social skill collided with material reality and lost. In April 1916, visiting her cousin Corinne Muston at Pensacola Naval Air Station in Florida, she met Earl Winfield Spencer, Jr., Win, a U.S. Navy aviator. The attraction was quick, and the marriage came soon after. 8 November 1916 at Christ Episcopal Church in Baltimore. Win was heavy drinking before the wedding. After it, according to multiple biographers, he was alcoholic and physically abusive. He left her for 4 months in 1920. She stayed in San Diego. They were briefly reunited in Washington in spring 1921, then separated again almost immediately when he was posted to the Far East. She remained in Washington for most of the next 4 years, 1921 through roughly 1925. The future Duchess of Windsor was a separated Navy wife working the edges of Washington society with no income beyond what the family provided, sharing a small Georgetown house, lunching at the Hotel Hamilton on K Street, attending the Soissons Gourmets, the city's French-speaking lunch society. At these lunches, she met Felipe Espil, the Argentine embassy's first secretary. He engaged her seriously enough to reshape her thinking about the marriage she was already exiting. The divorce from Spencer was finalized in December 1927. The second marriage was the rational correction. Ernest Aldrich Simpson was an Anglo-American shipping executive, a former Coldstream Guards officer with blue eyes and good manners, who divorced his first wife to marry Wallis on 21 July 1928 at the Register Office in Chelsea. He was kind, cultivated, intellectually serious. He kept a collection of antiquarian books and read Latin and Greek for pleasure. His son, who learned of his father's identity only after Ernest's death and subsequently left England for Israel, later recalled that Ernest wanted nothing more than to be considered an English gentleman. He was sufficiently solvent to give Wallis the household she knew how to run. They settled first in Mayfair with 4 servants, then moved into a larger flat. Wallis became a noted London hostess, praised by contemporaries for wit, style, and the ability to assemble evenings that people actually wanted to attend and remembered afterward. The financial position was never as stable as it appeared. Wallis's investments had been wiped out in the 1929 Wall Street crash. Her mother died penniless that same November. Ernest's shipping business was under strain by the mid-1930s. The Simpsons were living beyond their means, dismissing staff, cutting expenses. No evidence of significant independent wealth under Wallis's sole control has emerged from this period. She retained jewelry and personal property, but no independent income, no savings of consequence, no floor of her own making. She was a woman of considerable gifts, operating in a world that offered women of her class precisely one financial mechanism: attachment to a man with resources. She had been working that mechanism, in one form or another, since she was old enough to understand what poor relation meant. The man she became attached to was known, privately, as David. His public name was Edward. His full baptized name was Edward Albert Christian George Andrew Patrick David. 7 given names, each carrying dynastic and religious weight, the last of which was the one his family actually used. To his mother, his siblings, his intimate circle, David. His nanny had called him David. His lovers called him David. In the letters he wrote from Canadian tours and military postings and Fort Belvedere weekends, he signed himself David. The public called him the Prince of Wales, then Edward VIII. The distance between those two men, the public figure of extraordinary celebrity and the private David of arrested development and comfortable habit, was where most of his adult life was actually lived. The public Edward was among the most celebrated people in the world. As Prince of Wales through the 1920s, he toured Canada, Australia, India, and New Zealand, drawing crowds that observers compared to those for film stars. He was charming, modern in manner, and genuinely popular with veterans and working-class people in ways that more formally regal royals weren't. His father, George V, watching all of it from a distance, reportedly said, "After I am dead, the boy will ruin himself within 12 months." It took 11. Philip Ziegler's authorized biography, the most thorough single account of Edward VIII, based on full access to private papers, assessed him with the care of a biographer trying hard to be fair and finding very little to be fair about. His private letters, well into adulthood, read like those of a middle schooler who never mastered the English language. At Oxford, he complained of a lecture. "It was very hard to understand, and I don't think I shall go anymore." He argued with Thomas Hardy about whether Hardy had written Tests of the D'Urbervilles. His diary entries about Germany in his youth described the population as fat, stolid, unsympathetic. Italians were a repulsive nation. The French were hopelessly decadent. His years as Prince of Wales constituted, in Ziegler's summary, a rake's progress of romantic liaisons, drunken escapades, and academic failures, interrupted by uneventful military service and occasional diplomatic tours. Ziegler concluded that, "Rarely can a Prince of Wales have approached the idea of his enthronement with less enthusiasm." The man himself had been explicit about this, in writing, since at least 1919. In a letter to a mistress, he wrote that he felt he wasn't big enough a man to take on what he considered just about the biggest job in the world. He would say versions of this for the next 17 years. The job arrived anyway, on the 20th of January 1936, when his father, George V, died at Sandringham. His permanent retreat from the world of official duty had a physical address: Fort Belvedere, on Shrubs Hill, Windsor Great Park, Surrey. His father had granted him the house following a request that George V greeted with visible skepticism. What could you possibly want that queer old place for? Before relenting. The previous occupant had left it described as suffering from dust inches deep, splintered doors, and sagging floors. Edward poured himself into the renovation. The total cost of redecoration, including plumbing and repairs, came to £21,000, equivalent to over £1 million today. He added bathrooms adjacent to nearly every room at a time when adjacent bathrooms were still rare in British homes. He installed a steam room. He built a swimming pool between 1931 and 1932. He planted the gardens himself, often pulling weekend guests, including his brother Bertie, the future George VI, into the landscaping work. Prime Minister Baldwin, visiting in late 1936, complimented him on the silvery radiance of the birch trees and the delicacy of the autumn tints. He entertained every weekend. The guest list drew from court and diplomacy and, increasingly, American social life. Courtiers and diplomats, American men of affairs and English society, garnished with a sprinkling of statesmen, soldiers, and sailors, as one account described it. The atmosphere was informal, intimate, designed for pleasure first and ceremony not at all. This was the place he loved. Fort Belvedere as refuge, as creation, as the one space in his life that operated by his terms rather than everyone else's. When he became king in January 1936, the formal machinery of monarchy arrived with the roll. The red boxes, the state papers, the official documentation that had passed through every previous monarch's hands as a matter of course. Officials reported finding the boxes left unguarded around the fort. Edward notoriously neglected the documents, to the point where, according to the account later preserved in Ziegler's biography and other sources, wary officials began removing sensitive papers from his possession. The situation grew sufficiently concerning that in December 1936, as the abdication crisis broke, British intelligence sought interception of the king's telephone communications between Fort Belvedere and the European continent. The King of England was having his phone tapped by his own government before he had been on the throne 12 months. His abdication broadcast would open, "I have found it impossible to carry the heavy burden of responsibility and to discharge my duties as king as I would wish to do without the help and support of the woman I love." That was true. It was also incomplete. He had found it impossible long before Wallis Simpson appeared at Borough Court in January 1931. The meeting happened because Thelma Furness, Viscountess Furness, was hosting a weekend party and needed people to fill it. Borough Court, the correct spelling, double R, was a country house near Borough-on-the-Hill, outside Melton Mowbray in Leicestershire. The house had been built in 1906 as a hunting lodge for the gentry and royalty who came for the Melton Mowbray season. It operated in the tradition of English country houses where the weekend was its own social world, insulated from everything outside by distance and convention, and the specific rhythm of meals, walks, sport, and firelit evenings. Thelma Furness was Edward's mistress at the time. The Simpsons were invited at the last moment, socially convenient additions to round out the numbers. January 1931, a cold Leicestershire weekend. Wallis, by at least one second-hand account, was fighting a head cold, not at her best, or so the memoir tradition suggests. The anecdote may be apocryphal, the meeting itself isn't. What is certain is that the Prince of Wales and a married American woman were introduced at a country house party, exchanged a few words, and moved on to other conversations. Wallis and the Prince reportedly discussed the relative merits of central heating in English homes. The conversation does not suggest a courtship. Nothing about January 1931 at Borough Court announced itself as historic. The relationship that followed was built slowly, over 3 years rather than ignited in a single moment. Between 1931 and 1934, Edward encountered the Simpsons at various social events. Wallis was presented at court in 1932. The couple spent their first weekend at Fort Belvedere together in late January 1932. By early 1935, 2 rooms at the fort had been combined for Wallis's use, an architectural acknowledgement of how central she had become to the household. The decisive shift came in late 1933, when Thelma Furness sailed to New York in connection with the Vanderbilt custody case, and asked Wallis to look after the little man in her absence. When Furness returned, Wallis had replaced her. By the end of 1934, in Ziegler's phrase, Edward was slavishly dependent on Wallis. He had given enormous amounts of money and jewelry. His courtiers grew alarmed at what the attachment was doing to his official duties. His father was outraged, primarily, as Wallis's Wikipedia entry notes, on account of her marital history, since divorced people were generally excluded from court. The relationship interfered increasingly with everything the role of king required. What Wallis actually thought of all this, as distinct from what she later said she thought, would become clear only in 1936, and it wouldn't confirm the legend at all. Anne Seba's 2011 biography, That Woman, rests on a discovery that almost didn't happen. She was conducting a routine interview, a name to tick off a list, someone who had insisted they had nothing useful to tell her. As the conversation wound down, her host left the room and returned carrying a packet of blue letters tied with ribbon. "You might find these interesting," he said. Seba later described the moment. "I remember how my heart leapt." She began transcribing immediately, sitting on the sofa where she was, working through the large round handwriting on the pages. A cache of letters, postmarked 1936 and 1937, written by Wallis not to Edward, but to Ernest Simpson, the husband she was in the process of divorcing. They were still in their original envelopes. The postmarks trace the geography of the crisis: Felixstowe, where Wallis had taken up temporary residence in October 1936, so her divorce case could be heard at Ipswich Assizes; Cannes, where she retreated afterward; further stops as the winter dragged on. The first line Seba transcribed jumped from the page. "I am terrified of the court." The letter was dated 2 days before the divorce hearing. She wasn't writing to the man she was supposedly abandoning everything for. She was writing to the man she was about to divorce, telling him of her innermost fears. "I feel small and licked by it all," she admitted. She said she was so lonely she couldn't understand herself, and described this as the cause of all the misery. On 30 November, 10 days before the instrument of abdication was signed, she wrote to Ernest about her determination to escape England, perhaps forever, if she could. She would have to lie to the king about where she was going, she noted, and described her cover story as telling him the old search for hats story, because the king had threatened suicide if she tried to leave him. The woman popularly cast as the calculating power behind the throne was planning her escape via hat shopping as cover. She drafted a public statement, read to the press by Lord Brownlow, the king's lord-in-waiting, on 7 December 1936, indicating her willingness to give Edward up. Her solicitor made the next sequence of events explicit. Wallis was ready to do anything to ease the situation, but the other end of the wicket was determined. Edward wouldn't move. He was going to abdicate and marry her, and she couldn't prevent it. The letters continued after the crisis ended. She wrote to Ernest on her honeymoon in 1937 that, "I think of us so much, though I try not to." The private endearment she used, enum, part of the invented language she and Edward had developed, appeared in letters to Ernest as well, a revealing blurring of the two relationships. Seba's interpretation was direct. Wallis and Ernest privately discussed and, between themselves, ridiculed Edward's behavior. The private name they used for him was Peter Pan. Seba characterized the overall picture of Wallis in those months as a woman drowning, thrashing around and blaming everyone and everything. She was scared and grasping, Seba wrote, with good reason to be terrified for her future when all she once wanted was an adventure, a swan song before she was 40, just to reassure herself she was still attractive to men, and to give Mr. and Mrs. Simpson a leg up in society. But it had got out of hand as Edward became madly obsessed with Wallis, at any cost. "Wasn't life lovely, sweet, and simple?" Wallis wrote to Ernest from her siege at Cannes. "I can't believe that such a thing could have happened to two people who got along so well. At least it never should have been like it's now." The financial trap sharpens all of this into something specific. By December 1936, her divorce from Ernest was in progress. Her independent income was effectively non-existent. Investments wiped out in 1929, no subsequent earnings on record, the Simpson household itself running beyond its means. Her public association with the king had made any return to private life in Britain socially impossible. The only person who had the resources to provide any kind of future was the man she appears to have been, at some level, trying to escape. She had no floor. She had no exit. The irony that governs the rest of the argument arrives here. She wasn't acting for Britain. She couldn't even act effectively for herself. The outcome that followed, his abdication, was produced by two people acting entirely in their own interests. He was determined to have her. She had no viable path that didn't lead to him. The collision of those two facts produced, entirely by accident, something neither of them intended. Parliament ratified the abdication on 11 December 1936. That evening, Edward sat before a BBC microphone and told the Empire he had found it impossible to carry his duties without the woman he loved. The line launched decades of sympathy. A king undone by devotion, the question the line deflects, the question almost no one in Britain paused to ask that December, was what exactly the country was losing. Turn the calendar forward 11 months. October 1937. The Duke and Duchess of Windsor, Edward is Duke now, Wallis is Duchess, and pointedly not Her Royal Highness, arrive in Nazi Germany for a 12-day unofficial tour, arranged through the German Labor Front under Robert Ley. They travel at least partly on Hitler's personal train, the Führersanderzug. Their movements and phone calls are monitored by Nazi officials. Wallis is met at railway stations by cheering crowds and Nazi officials. She is greeted with the formal recognition of a state visit. Between 11 and 22nd of October 1937, the Windsors visit factories including armaments plants, an SS training facility called Ordensburg Krosensee, a Hitler youth camp, and Hermann Göring's vast estate at Carenhall. They meet Goebbels, Göring, Ribbentrop, Ley, and Speer. Wallis takes afternoon tea with Rudolf Hess. The Duke extends the Nazi salute at multiple points. The British government had advised against the visit. The Windsors went regardless. The tour was photographed extensively. Sir Dudley Forwood, the Duke's own equerry, compiled a personal album of the trip, authenticated and sold at auction in 2016 for £6,830. 60 images of the former King of England and his wife being entertained by Nazi leadership. The Duke at Carenhall. The Duke with his arm raised. The Duke and Duchess received with every ceremony of a state visit by a regime that had denied Wallis any equivalent recognition while Edward was still on the throne. Royal biographer Andrew Morton, speaking to BBC News about the auction, was explicit. The real purpose of the tour was to show Wallis a good time and see exactly what it was like to enjoy a royal tour. In Germany, members of the aristocracy bowed and curtsied to her. She was treated, Morton said, with all the dignity and status that the Duke always wanted, unlike the treatment she received from the British royal family, whom he described as treating her like an outcast and an outsider. Morton added that the Duke later came to recognize the trip as what Morton called a ghastly mistake, but noted that even after Germany's defeat, the Duke thought Hitler was a good fellow and that he'd done a good job in Germany, and he was also anti-Semitic before, during, and after the war. The tour's formal climax came on 22nd of October at Hitler's mountain residence, the Berghof, at Obersalzberg near Berchtesgaden. A private audience of approximately 1 hour. Hitler's personal interpreter, Paul Schmidt, was present. The official minutes of this meeting don't survive. They appear lost or destroyed during the war. What does survive is the Duke's own subsequent correspondence, a personal letter of thanks written in German to Hitler, thanking him for the wonderful time at Obersalzberg and stating that the tour had made a great impression. The letter survives in archival collections and has been cited by historians including Andrew Lowney in his research based on the Windsor files. This wasn't the beginning of the Duke's orientation toward Germany. It was its most visible and documented expression. Philip Ziegler's authorized biography records that as Prince of Wales, Edward praised both Hitler and Mussolini throughout the 1930s and maintained cordial ties with British fascist leader Oswald Mosley's organization. He had reportedly told people in his circle that dictators are very popular these days, and we might want one in England before long. More concretely, he undercut League of Nations efforts to sanction Mussolini's Italy and declined even to meet Ethiopian Emperor Haile Selassie during an official London visit. More seriously still, the Foreign Office discovered that state papers about Germany's military buildup were disappearing. Wary officials began removing sensitive documents from the royal mailbox rather than allowing them to pass through Edward's hands. The pattern extends before the abdication and runs continuously after it. In May 1939, less than 4 months before Germany invaded Poland, the Duke recorded a broadcast from France urging Britain to do all in its power to come to terms with Nazi Germany. The BBC refused to air it. The internal file card on the recording, preserved in BBC archives, reads, "Important, not to be broadcast." That document exists. In August 1939, 3 weeks before the German invasion of Poland, he sent Hitler a personal telegram seeking a peaceful settlement, invoking the rapport established during the 1937 visit. When France fell in June 1940, the Windsors moved through Madrid to Lisbon. Spanish diplomatic records from that period attribute to the Duke statements blaming the Jews, the Reds, and the Foreign Office for the war. German diplomatic cables from Lisbon, later recovered among the Marburg files, describe him as believing Britain had virtually lost the war and as being a firm supporter of a peaceful arrangement with Germany. These cables are German diplomatic documents, not verbatim transcripts of the Duke's words. They were written by foreign officials with political agendas of their own. Their contents reflect German diplomatic interests as well as reported statements. But they are consistent, entirely consistent, with everything else in the documentary record across more than a decade. Lord Halifax, writing in early August 1940, noted in a memo that British intelligence knew the Duke's villa owner in Lisbon was strongly pro-German, and that the Duke himself was manifesting what Halifax described as extreme defeatist and pacifist sympathies. Churchill responded by sending the Duke a personal written warning. Don't express views about the war or Hitler different from that adopted by the British nation and Parliament. The Prime Minister was writing formal reprimands to the former king about his conduct in the middle of the Battle of Britain. The German response to all of this was concrete and operational. In July 1940, German intelligence launched Operation Willy, a documented plan to retain or abduct the Duke of Windsor from Spain or Portugal. German Foreign Ministry records confirm that Hitler and Ribbentrop believed the Duke retained significant political influence and could be used for peace propaganda, or, in more extreme planning, reinstalled as a puppet king on a conquered British throne. The scheme failed, partly because the Duke accepted appointment as governor of the Bahamas and was physically removed from the European theater. Michael Bloch's 1984 book on the operation, drawn from the German documentary record, remains the standard academic treatment. The Marburg Files, German Foreign Ministry documents discovered by Allied forces at Schloss Marburg in May 1945, approximately 60 items of which related specifically to the Duke of Windsor, were transferred to Britain in 1948 and suppressed from public knowledge for years. Churchill discussed them with George VI. Both concluded the most damaging items shouldn't circulate. A small batch was released in 1954. The full collection was forced into publication in 1957 after sustained pressure. The Duke publicly denounced the contents as complete fabrications. Most historians who have examined the files accept them as authentic German governmental records, marked by the diplomatic interests of their authors, but not invented. Historian Karina Urbach, drawing on foreign archives, concluded that the Duke and his cousin Karl Edward of Coburg repeatedly discussed and worked toward an Anglo-German alliance, and that Windsor assisted those efforts on more than one occasion. The CBC's 2022 assessment of current scholarly consensus is direct. Historians believe the Duke of Windsor actively collaborated with the Nazis during the Second World War. The case isn't airtight. The evidence is fragmentary in places, diplomatically motivated in others, buried under decades of official suppression and counter-denial. What is documented, beyond reasonable dispute, is the trajectory. The 1937 tour, the thank you letter to Hitler, the suppressed 1939 broadcast, the 1939 telegram, the Halifax memo, the Churchill warning, Operation Willy, the Marburg files. Not one smoking gun, but a consistent, cross-sourced pattern stretching from before the abdication to after the Allied victory, assembled from British, German, Spanish, and American official sources. That was the man on the British throne in December 1936. What replaced him was, by contrast, a man whose temperament matched exactly what the decade demanded. Albert, Bertie to his family, became George VI on 11 December 1936. He had suffered from a chronic stammer since childhood that made every public speech a physical ordeal. He had spent years working with Australian speech therapist Lionel Logue in sessions that the 2010 film The King's Speech dramatized. Sessions that were, according to Logue's own diaries, difficult, demanding, and often discouraging before they began to produce results. He was, by most accounts, genuinely appalled at the role that had been suddenly placed in his hands. He didn't have his brother's celebrity ease or his fluency in a crowd. He wasn't the Golden Prince of Wales. He was the other one. He had something more useful. He understood what the job was for. When the Luftwaffe began bombing British cities in September 1940, George VI and Queen Elizabeth stayed in London. They declined evacuation. Buckingham Palace was bombed multiple times across the Blitz. On 13 September 1940, bombs struck the palace while the King and Queen were in residence. They heard the aircraft, the detonation, watched the glass shatter in the quadrangle courtyard. Afterward, they walked through the rubble. They inspected the damage. They remained. Queen Elizabeth's remark about the bombing, that she could now look the East End in the face, entered public consciousness almost immediately and became one of the defining gestures of the entire war. Not the fact of the bombing, but the decision to stay for it. The palace had been hit. The king was still there. This meant something to people living in cities that were burning. Churchill and the new king had not begun on easy terms. Churchill had supported Edward during the abdication crisis, and George VI had reason to be wary of a prime minister who had been on his brother's side. Over the course of the war, that wariness converted first into professional respect, and then into something the International Churchill Society has described as a genuine personal friendship, their regular Tuesday lunches becoming one of the quiet institutional rhythms of wartime governance. Two men who had not liked each other finding, over the worst years any British government had faced, that they trusted each other. George VI wasn't spectacular. He was steady. In the circumstances of 1940 through 1945, that steadiness was the entire requirement. Now place the other man there instead. A man whose government dispatched official written warnings about his pro-German statements while the war was ongoing. A man who sent the enemy's head of state a personal telegram weeks before the invasion of Poland. A man who, while Britain was fighting for its survival in the summer of 1940, was being assessed by the Foreign Secretary as dangerously defeatist, and simultaneously assessed by Nazi intelligence as useful enough to be worth kidnapping as a potential puppet king for a German-controlled Britain. A man who had toured Nazi Germany's armaments facilities and SS training centers in 1937, thanked their leader in a personal letter afterward, and, by multiple accounts, maintained that view of Hitler well into the post-war decades. The argument does not require you to believe Edward would have formally surrendered. It requires only that he was structurally the wrong person for that moment, and that the constitutional accident of his removal placed the right person there instead. The abdication crisis itself, the machinery that produced this outcome, was less a conspiracy than an institutional immune response. Stanley Baldwin, the Conservative Prime Minister, managed the process with a specific strategic objective, making abdication the only viable constitutional outcome while allowing Edward to believe the decision was his own. When Edward proposed a morganatic marriage on 16 November 1936, he would remain king, Wallis wouldn't be queen, Baldwin's response was unambiguous. He told Edward on 25 November that such proposals had no constitutional foundation, that there is no such thing as what is called morganatic marriage known to our law. He then sent coordinated telegrams to the Prime Ministers of Canada, Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, and the Irish Free State, laying out 3 options and gathering Dominion opinion that confirmed the establishment's position. Cosmo Gordon Lang, the Archbishop of Canterbury since 1928, worked in parallel concert with Baldwin. Robert Beacon's biography of Lang argues that he played a much more decisive part in the crisis than popular memory allows, meeting with Baldwin repeatedly and privately urging that Edward be brought to abdication in a way that would appear as his own free decision. The Church of England's position was constitutionally load-bearing. The king was supreme governor of the church, and the church wouldn't sanction the remarriage of a divorcee whose former spouse was still living. This wasn't merely a matter of clerical preference, it was constitutional structure. The British press maintained silence on Edward's relationship with Wallis for months, well into late 1936, while American and European newspapers reported it freely. Foreign magazines entering British ports were intercepted and censored at customs. When the Communist MP Willie Gallagher told lobby reporters he saw no reason why the king shouldn't marry Wallis, not a syllable of it appeared in print. The dam broke only on 2 December 1936, when provincial newspapers, led by the Yorkshire Post, published the first hints that a constitutional crisis was developing. 4 December saw abdication in print for the first time. The instrument was signed on 10 December. The act passed on 11 December. The British establishment had decided, and it executed the decision within a week of public awareness. The Windsors lived out the rest of their lives in France. After the war, after the Bahamas, After a long social circuit between Europe and America, always welcome in certain rooms, always pointedly absent from others, the city of Paris leased them a villa in 1953. The house is at 4 Route du Champ d'Entraînement, in the northwest section of the Bois de Boulogne, near the southern edge of Neuilly-sur-Seine. Originally named Château Le Bois, it was a 14-room French neoclassical villa, 3 floors, built between 1928 and 1929 by architect Roger Bouvard. Charles de Gaulle had lived there with his family from 1944 to 1946. The Windsors took it on a nominal lease from the city of Paris and set about making it habitable for the kind of life they intended to lead. Wallis supervised the refurbishment through Maison Janssen, the Parisian decorating firm. The house was arranged with precision. The rooms, the table settings, the flowers, the placement of furniture, everything reflecting the same meticulous attention that had characterized her London entertaining 20 years earlier. The pugs were numerous and indulged. The dogs of the Windsors became, in time, as famous as their owners in certain circles, and the servants who managed the household moved with the practiced efficiency of a well-run operation. The visitor's book from Fort Belvedere, the one Edward had carried away from the Surrey house on the morning of the abdication, presumably traveled with them, a relic of the place he had loved most. The question of the HRH title never stopped haunting both of them. By letters patent issued at the time of their 1937 marriage, Wallis was denied the style of Her Royal Highness. She was the Duchess of Windsor. She wasn't received at court. She wasn't officially welcomed back to England on any public occasion. The exclusion wasn't accidental. It was policy, maintained without relenting through multiple reigns and governments, until both of them were dead and buried at Frogmore. Edward died at Villa Windsor on 28 May 1972 of throat cancer, aged 77. Wallis died there on 24 April 1986 of bronchial pneumonia, aged 89. The death notice recorded her address as 4 Route du Champ d'Entraînement, Paris, France. Both are buried in the Royal Burial Ground at Frogmore, Windsor, grounds she had never been officially received at while alive. The social life they maintained in exile was elaborate, by necessity. The dinner parties were real events, with real guests, requiring real preparation. Reportedly, Wallis kept a small notebook by her plate to record which evenings had gone well and which had not. Placement of guests, conversation, performance of the table, what worked and what didn't. A hostess's accounting. The social intelligence that had been her most dependable asset since Oldfield School in Maryland formalized into a nightly ritual across 3 decades of Parisian exile. The detail may or may not be literally true, the biographer's record isn't definitive on it, but the practice it describes is entirely consistent with everything documented about her. The precision, the watchfulness, the serious management of social occasion as a form of work. She was still doing at the table in the Bois de Boulogne what she had always done: reading the room, managing the evening, keeping score. "You have no idea how hard it's to live out a great romance," she said in later years. The line arrives differently when you know the 1936 letters, the woman writing to Ernest that she wanted to flee England, perhaps forever, that she was small and licked by it all, that life with him had been lovely, sweet, and simple, and she had not understood its value until it was gone. The standard verdict on the abdication ran in British popular culture for decades. The romantic tragedy of the king who loved too much. Edward the sacrifice, Wallis the instrument of loss. The narrative was so complete and so satisfying as narrative that the evidence accumulating through declassified files and opened archives registered only slowly against it. The Marburg files, the British and German diplomatic records, the suppressed BBC recording marked "important, not to be broadcast," the Operation Villy documentation, and the sustained work of historians including Andrew Lowney and Karina Urbach across the past 30 years together tell a different story. Not a tidy conspiracy, not a settled verdict, a pattern. A man whose recorded words and actions, assembled from the archives of multiple countries, point consistently in one direction across more than a decade. From the missing state papers in 1936 to the thank you letter to Hitler in 1937 to the suppressed peace broadcast in 1939 to the Halifax memo in 1940. That was the man on the British throne in December 1936. That was the man who would have been sitting there when Britain declared war on Germany 9 months later. The man the country pitied for losing his throne was the man the country couldn't have survived keeping. There is a version of December 1936 in which the establishment flinches, in which the morganatic compromise is found workable by one more careful reading of constitutional precedent, in which Edward VIII sits on the throne on the 3rd of September 1939 when the Prime Minister addresses a nation at war. The same Germany whose leader Edward had thanked personally for a wonderful time 2 years earlier. The same Germany whose intelligence service assessed him, in the summer of 1940, as a potential puppet king worth kidnapping. The same Germany that Churchill was formally warning him not to express sympathy with, while the Battle of Britain was being fought in the sky above southern England. That version isn't recorded history. It's the shadow of recorded history, the shape of what didn't happen, visible only because of what did. What did happen is that a woman born in a Pennsylvania resort town in 1896, raised on borrowed social capital in Baltimore, married twice for stability and found stability only partially, became entangled in a relationship she appears to have wanted to exit long before it produced the crisis that ended it, and couldn't escape. She tried. She wrote the letters. She drafted the statement. She told Ernest she wanted to flee England. She planned the hat-shopping cover story. None of it was enough to move the man who had decided she was worth a crown. The outcome of her failure to escape, his abdication, placed a steady, duty-bound king on the throne, instead of a man being assessed by his own foreign secretary as manifesting extreme defeatist and pacifist sympathies, while German intelligence was plotting to use him as a puppet. She wasn't a heroine. She wasn't a villain. She was trapped, and she was acting for herself. And the self-interest of two people acting at cross purposes produced something neither of them intended. At Villa Windsor, night after night across the long exile, she managed the table and noted what worked and what didn't, and kept score in whatever form she kept it. The small victories of a dinner well managed, the pleasures of the household running exactly as it should. The social intelligence applied, as it always had been, to whatever room she was in. She never got to record the largest victory, the one that happened before anyone knew there was a game. The marriage the country condemned may have been the reason the country survived the man she married. The abdication everyone mourned was, all along, the escape nobody thanked her for. Subscribe for more stories like this.